He began his journey as an insecure and unsuccessful writer, yet eventually transformed into one of the most sinister symbols of the 20th century. His very surname has turned into a generic term, as mentioning it immediately brings to mind political manipulation that brings no less devastation than flying projectiles and heavy artillery. Even though the global community strongly condemned and rejected his dark teachings, there is surprisingly no shortage of modern followers who adopt his methods. We will dive deep into the story of the chief manipulator of the infamous German regime, exploring how a young, harsh critic of the rising leader suddenly became his most devoted disciple. You'll discover his methods for orchestrating public violence while maintaining an illusion of complete innocence, the psychological tricks that turned blatant falsehoods into a flawless instrument of influence, and the truth behind the infamous quotes widely attributed to him on the internet today. Like many notorious historical figures, this man endured a deeply miserable childhood. Born into an impoverished Catholic household in the western part of his country, the boy struggled with severe ailments and barely survived his 4th year of life. A permanent severe limp made him an outcast among other children, forcing the young boy to channel all his energy into rigorous academic pursuits, where he actually achieved remarkable results. His parents deeply hoped he would pursue a spiritual path as a clergyman, but the young student decided to dedicate himself to history and philological studies instead. His transition into adulthood brought only bitter disappointments, as his physical disability prevented him from joining the front lines of the First World War, an event that struck him as a profound personal tragedy. The theatrical plays and journalistic articles he desperately penned attracted absolutely no interest from the public or publishers, and even defending a doctoral dissertation failed to advance his stagnant career. Forced to retreat to his parents' home, he endured constant reproaches from his family while finding a convenient scapegoat for his creative failures in Jewish editors and publishing house owners. These early resentments planted the deep seeds of his extreme prejudice. In 1924, the 26-year-old intellectual encountered the rising nationalist movement and quickly realized he had found his ideological brethren. Shortly after the formerly banned political faction was legally re-established, he officially joined their ranks, marking the dawn of a completely new chapter in his life. The energetic new member quickly displayed a remarkable talent for public persuasion, catching the attention of the high-ranking leadership who appointed him as the chief editor of a prominent nationalist publication named after the concept of national freedom. Interestingly, he initially aligned himself with the internal opposition, strongly supporting the rival brothers within the faction rather than the primary leader. During one intense gathering, he even loudly demanded that the petty bourgeois future dictator be permanently expelled from their political circles. However, thoroughly studying the infamous manifesto and holding a personal meeting with the charismatic faction head completely shifted his perspective. From that pivotal moment forward, the young propagandist morphed into a fanatically loyal supporter. His absolute devotion was swiftly rewarded with a massive promotion, appointing him as the supreme regional leader of the capital city. Embracing this new authority, he aggressively claimed dominance over the urban streets, orchestrating an expansive network of anti-communist and prejudiced campaigns. He routinely engineered calculated street clashes, firmly believing that the capital thrived on sensationalism and that any political movement failing to grasp this concept was doomed to fail. To amplify his message, he launched a highly aggressive newspaper aptly named after the concept of a forward assault, turning it into the primary mouthpiece for his radical movement. When a prominent radical activist lost his life during a clash with political rivals in February 1930, the brilliant manipulator instantly elevated the fallen man to the status of a legendary martyr. A song written by the deceased activist was swiftly adopted as the official anthem of the movement, while his heavily romanticized image became a fundamental pillar of their relentless psychological campaigning. Later that same year, the country faced unscheduled parliamentary elections, and the movement entrusted their entire campaign strategy to their star propagandist. He executed the task flawlessly, organizing thousands of passionate rallies across the nation where leaders vehemently demanded a new racially unified society, fiercely condemned the post-war peace treaties, and continuously stoked the flames of national revenge. The results were absolutely staggering, bringing the movement over 6.5 million votes, securing a solid second place, and granting them 107 parliamentary seats, which was exactly 9 times more than their previous electoral attempt. Also in 1930, he actively orchestrated massive disruptions during the screening of a famous anti-war film based on a popular novel, eventually forcing authorities to ban the picture nationwide under the pretext that it damaged national prestige. The defining climax of his career arrived in 1933, when his political faction finally seized total control of the state, making him the supreme minister of public enlightenment and public persuasion. This immense power allowed him to unleash his dark talents without any restrictions, immediately initiating massive bans on any independent press, opposing literature, or dissenting public speech. By October, a draconian editorial law forced all journalists to strictly align their work with the official state philosophy and governance concepts. Lists dividing literature into acceptable and harmful categories were meticulously compiled, leading to massive public bonfires where works by prominent authors were tossed into the flames while crowds chanted slogans specifically crafted by his department. The minister personally delivered a fiery speech at one of these infamous Capitol Square gatherings while the literary masterpieces burned behind him. He quickly realized that the wireless broadcast would dominate his era just as the printing press had ruled the previous century, explicitly stating this vision during a major address on the 18th of August, 1933. Every single broadcasting station was aggressively seized and placed under the direct micromanagement of his ministry, while tuning into foreign frequencies was criminalized. He heavily subsidized the mass production of incredibly affordable public receivers, offering long-term credit options that made the devices accessible to almost every household. By 1938, over 10 million of these devices had been distributed, ensuring that at least one receiver existed for every 8 citizens. Public loudspeakers were additionally installed in factories, schools, and city squares, earning the informal nickname of the minister's personal mouthpiece. A cornerstone of this new, terrifying worldview was the systematic exclusion of a specific demographic group from all aspects of society, stripping them of governmental roles, professional careers, and basic commerce rights. The official rhetoric grew increasingly hostile until words inevitably transformed into widespread sorrow and physical devastation. When a foreign diplomat was deprived of his life in Paris in November 1938 by an aggrieved individual, the minister ruthlessly seized the incident as the perfect excuse to orchestrate massive, coordinated attacks, falsely presenting the orchestrated violence as a spontaneous outburst of public outrage. During a major gathering, he hypocritically claimed the state would never organize such actions, but conveniently noted that law enforcement would not intervene if the people decided to strike back at the perceived enemies of the state. That very night, trained stormtroopers disguised as ordinary citizens systematically devastated thousands of storefronts and places of worship in what became known as the Night of Broken Glass. These horrific events served as a dark prelude to the most catastrophic state-sponsored persecutions in human history, eventually leading to one of the darkest pages of history. The manipulative genius relied on 5 foundational pillars to construct his empire of deceit. First came the rule of partial truth, dictating that every fabricated story must contain a widely accepted factual element to make the overall deception highly credible. Second was the concept of the massive fabrication, often associated with a famous quote claiming that people more readily swallow a colossal fiction than a tiny distortion. While he never actually penned those exact words, as they originated from his leader's infamous book, the minister continuously applied this exact psychological mechanism. The third pillar demanded absolute simplicity, ensuring the ideological message was primitive enough to be instantly absorbed. The fourth rule required speaking the exact cultural language of the targeted demographic to ensure complete comprehension. Finally, the fifth principle relied on relentless repetition, operating on the dark assumption that a lie reiterated enough times eventually magically transforms into perceived truth. This chillingly systematic approach proved disastrously effective, allowing the propagandist to elevate his leader to a godlike status, turn a hateful ideology into a sacred doctrine, and convince an entire nation to enthusiastically embrace global conflict and mass historical tragedies. Even though he initially met the outbreak of the Second World War with extreme caution rather than joy, he immediately redirected the colossal power of his media machine to ensure total victory. He meticulously magnified every single military triumph while entirely burying any news of battlefield disasters. The undisputed pinnacle of his dark oratory skills occurred during his infamous total conflict speech, delivered to an ecstatic crowd of thousands at the Capitol's massive sports palace on the 18th of February 1943, shortly after the devastating military collapse on the Eastern Front. Speaking continuously for 109 minutes on a live national broadcast, he fiercely challenged the citizens, asking if they truly desired a conflict more radical and absolute than anything previously imaginable. The frenzied audience erupted in overwhelming hysteria, screaming their absolute devotion to the endless struggle. Despite his monumental efforts to sustain morale, the total collapse of the state became utterly undeniable. The architect of endless warfare desperately tried to project confidence in public, but his private writings clearly acknowledged that the nation was completely doomed. This hidden despair slowly seeped into his final public addresses, which became heavily laced with apocalyptic undertones. Historians widely believe he was the primary voice convincing the failing dictator to remain in the besieged capital to the bitter end, arguing that a highly symbolic, defiant downfall was the only appropriate conclusion for their empire. He aggressively urged the trapped civilians to fight street by street, claiming their supreme leader stood beside them and that their final stand would awaken the entire nation. Unlike many other high-ranking officials who fled in terror, the chief deceiver stayed absolutely loyal to his commander until the very last moment. After the dictator willingly ended his life, the propagandist briefly inherited the title of chancellor, but merely one day later, he too voluntarily departed from life. He took his entire family with him, forcing his wife and 6 young children to consume a fatal potion before slipping into darkness. During the subsequent international military tribunals, prosecutors heavily emphasized that his psychological manipulation was one of the most destructive tools of the regime, used from the very beginning to infect the masses with radical ideology and psychologically prepare them for aggressive military expansion. Although the grand manipulator managed to escape facing justice in the courtroom, his surviving colleagues were held accountable before the global tribunal. Unfortunately, his highly deceptive legacy continues to plague the modern world, as his exact manipulative techniques are continuously resurrected in the digital age, proving that those who weaponize information must ultimately face severe consequences. He meticulously documented his thoughts in private journals for over 20 years, miraculously surviving the global conflict to serve as a crucial historical warning. The complete collection of these writings, spanning 29 massive volumes, was fully published only in his native country, though numerous translated fragments are studied worldwide. Just like the private records of other notorious figures, these pages provide chilling insights into the exact psychological deterioration that leads to crimes against humanity. Modern scholars deeply emphasize the necessity of reading these texts alongside extensive academic annotations to fully grasp the disturbing context. Some entries reveal an absolutely nauseating level of arrogance toward the very citizens he supposedly inspired, while his final wartime writings clearly demonstrate that the ultimate architect of deception eventually fell victim to his own elaborate illusions.